Perth cracks with thunder. Lightning rips through the museum skylight, spilling cold light onto a wooden crate trembling at the room's heart. Inside, iron hooves strike slowly like the heartbeat of a secret clawing out of its grave. Mira freezes as the horse's red eyes streak across the security camera, a ghostly flare in the dusty rain. Every warning, do not open unless you hear it. Winnie comes too late. A spirit once nailed down rises, demanding one answer. Who forced me to kneel? With each echoing hoofstep, the darkest past draws nearer, begging to be heard, begging for redemption. Subscribe now so you won't miss our next haunting and inspirational storytelling episodes. The first frame flickered in black and white. A CCTV feed. Static. A grainy timestamp blinking 3:16 a.m. Wind howled in muffled frequencies as the camera shook ever so slightly. Rows of rusted shelving units stood like skeletal sentries in the warehouse. Forgotten crates? Torn tarps? A floor scuffed with stains no one bothered to name. A bolt of lightning slit through the night sky. For a breath, the whole warehouse lit up in a jagged strobe, revealing a sudden, eerie emptiness, as though the air itself had just exhaled a secret. Then darkness again. And then it came. Clink, a single sound. Like iron meeting iron in a rhythm unpracticed. Clink, then silence. Again, the camera buzzed, shifted, tilted a centimeter to the left, as though it too were straining to hear what didn't belong. Clink, no footsteps. No shadow. Just the unmistakable echo of a hoof, meeting metal slow and deliberate, bouncing off the hollow steel bones of the warehouse. Then cut to black. A beat. And then daylight. Inside the same warehouse, now saturated in the pale morning sun, filtered through the dirty skylights, above a small team of municipal cleaners pushed in through a side door. The air held the smell of rust dust and forgotten history. Mira walked slightly behind the others, a gray hoodie pulled up, sleeves tugged tight over hands. She moved like a shadow. Not timid, not loud, just careful. She wore the fluorescent yellow of the city maintenance crew. But unlike the others, who joked or groaned about the size of the job ahead, Mira didn't speak. She scanned, always scanning. She paused at a rack of ancient fire extinguishers, their labels peeled off long ago. Her fingers hovered above one for a second before pulling back. Behind her, someone called out her name, mispronounced as always. "Mira, yo, you taking inventory or zoning out?" It was Theo, a fellow cleaner swinging a trash bag like a wrecking ball. She didn't answer, just gave a polite, tired smile and turned back to her cart. Mira was new to Perth. Well, new enough that she still didn't understand half the street slang, and old enough to know most people didn't ask where she was from because they cared. They asked because they wanted a quick label. She kept her head down, did the job, noticed things no one else did. Like now, she had paused again, this time near the far back wall, where the light barely reached. A faint change in air temperature. A subtle wrongness in how the concrete reflected sound. She moved toward it while the others swept, sorted, joked about the spiders. That's when Edwin appeared. He pushed through the main door, arms full of folders, a messenger bag knocking against his thigh. Tall, lean, late 20s with eyes too bright for the shadows he kept walking into. He wore the badge of the Perth Historical Fellowship, and the badge wore him like an ironic statement. "Hi, you guys. Must be city cleanup," he asked, adjusting his glasses. "Ask her if she's the boss of silence." Theo chuckled, jerking a thumb toward Mira. She didn't respond. Edwin turned toward her, his tone softening. "Hey, you okay? You hear me?" She nodded, eyes still focused beyond him, past him. Edwin followed her gaze. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at something behind a tall sheet of warped, corrugated metal partially hidden beneath a collapsed beam. He squinted. "What is that?" They approached it together. The corrugated sheet was wedged awkwardly into the corner. Mira moved, first fingers curling around the rusted edge. She didn't pull with force, just pressed gently, and the metal creaked aside like a reluctant confession. What lay behind it was unexpected. A crate, not just any crate, an old shipping trunk, deep mahogany, gone black from time, sealed all around with thick iron bands. But that wasn't what stopped them. It was what sat on top of the crate. A horseshoe, no more than one. 4 heavy blackened iron horseshoes, each nailed to the top surface at the 4 corners, angled like a twisted compass rose. The nails weren't bent or rusted. They were driven clean through the wood as if sealing something in. There was writing. Mira leaned forward, brushing her gloved hand over the grime. The letters had been etched, not written by blade, by something desperate. The cuts were shallow but deliberate. "Do not open unless you hear it, Winnie." Her breath hitched. Edwin crouched beside her, blinking. "Is this a joke?" Mira shook her head slowly. "I mean, that's not some folklore quote I've heard before." "That's," warning Mira said quietly. It was the first word she'd spoken all morning. Edwin looked up at her, surprised. She reached out, fingers grazing the iron of the nearest horseshoe. It was cold. Much colder than it should have been. And beneath the temperature, something else. A vibration, no. A resistance. Like the metal wasn't just old, it was watching. Her hand froze above it. Camera close-up. Her fingernails trembled slightly in the glove. She tried to steady her breath, but a chill moved up her arm, uninvited. Edwin didn't notice. He had already started cataloging. Hang on. This isn't on any of the schematics. No records mention sealed crates like this. I should call this in. Mira didn't answer. She was still staring at the horseshoe. Her reflection warped in its curve. But behind the blur of her own eyes, she could have sworn, for a single moment, something blinked back at her. She snatched her hand away. The light in the warehouse dimmed. It wasn't the sun. It wasn't the skylights. It was a pressure. An atmospheric shift, like a gathering storm in the lungs of the building. The other workers were too far across the space to notice. Mira stepped back. Edwin stood now pacing. Maybe it's ceremonial, a colonial artifact. Mira spoke again, voice flat, eyes unfocused. It's a prison, he laughed nervously. You think they used it to hold animals? No, she said. The word echoed in the stillness. She didn't elaborate. Edwin reached for his phone, snapping pictures. This is definitely going to the lab, maybe even straight to the museum. Could be big, especially if it's... Clink! They both froze. Clink! Again. The sound was clear now. Not a creak, not metal shifting from wind. A hoof on steel, but it wasn't coming from the crate. It was coming from the rafters above. From the metal grating along the walkways where no one had stepped in decades. Edwin craned his neck, eyes searching the upper levels. Did you hear that? Mira didn't move. Her body had gone stiff, jaw clenched, eyes glassy. Clink! The sound moved, along the rafters, then silence. Edwin tried to brush it off. Probably pigeons. But Mira whispered, pigeons don't walk in four. He turned to her, half laughing. Come on, don't be. But Mira wasn't with him anymore. Her eyes were locked on the crate again. She took a single step forward. Edwin reached out instinctively, trying to pull her back. Mira, wait. Don't. She crouched. Her fingers hovered just an inch above the iron horseshoe again. Zoom in. Her breath fogged slightly despite the room's warmth. She whispered something barely audible. Do you remember? Her own voice startled her. Not because she said it, but because she didn't know why. Behind them, the door slammed shut. Both of them turned. No one there. Clink. This time it was right behind the crate. No movement, no source. Just sound. Mira stood up slowly, looking at Edwin. We shouldn't be here. He wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her it was just rust and air and imagination. But then, the camera angle widened. In the shadows behind them, at the farthest point of the warehouse, in a spot the sunlight never touched. 2 red pinpricks hovered mid-air. Low, reflective, watching. Then gone. The screen flickers once more. Cut to the CCTV footage again, this time in color. A security monitor room. A guard rewinds, plays, rewinds. He freezes the frame on something barely visible. A glint of red just beyond the edge of clarity. He leans closer, presses play. Clink, fade to black. The warehouse had gone unnaturally quiet. Not the kind of quiet that follows lunch breaks or sleeping neighborhoods. This quiet had weight. Density. Like something invisible was pressing down from the rafters above and the concrete below. Like the air had agreed to hold its breath. Mira stood motionless in front of the crate, her gaze still fixed on the iron horseshoes nailed into the wood. Edwin was pacing a few feet behind her, muttering about proper protocols, his phone still raised. You know, we really shouldn't be touching this until someone from the archive team gets here, he said, nervous energy bouncing in his voice. There's a chain of custody for... But she wasn't listening. Her fingers hovered over one of the nails. Thick, rusted black driven clean into the crate like a stake. She ran her thumb along the edge of the horseshoe, then touched the head of the nail. The cold jolted her. Not cold like metal, cold like memory. She felt it in her jaw, her chest, her molars. She dropped her hand, but didn't step back. Instead, she exhaled slowly and reached into the canvas pouch at her hip. Out came a flathead screwdriver, not from the warehouse, not issued by the city. It was hers, worn, personal. I need you to stop, Edwin said. Seriously, what are you doing? She didn't answer. The screwdriver slid beneath the first nail. A crack, then a hiss, not air, not steam, but a sound like something exhaling from the grain of the wood itself. The iron squealed as she pried it free, slow and careful. The nail released with a groan that reverberated deep through the floor. Then came the next, and the next. Each motion was deliberate. Each pull felt like peeling something off the surface of her own skin. Edwin tried again, voice lower now. Do you even know what's in there? Mira looked up, just once. Her eyes were wet. Not tears, not yet. But like something inside her was leaking out without permission. She pulled the last nail, All 4 horseshoes clattered to the ground at once, like the final beat in a dirge. The crate shuddered. The top of the trunk didn't pop open. It didn't explode or release gas or emit anything cinematic. It simply creaked, timid, like it was testing the light, and then it opened. The hinges, brittle with age, moaned as the lid gave way. The sound was slow crawling like a rusted jaw being pried open after a century of silence. The smell hit first. Thick, coppery, dry rot and iron and something older. Edwin recoiled instinctively, covering his mouth. Mira didn't move. Inside the crate sat something wrapped in stained linen, bound tightly with coarse rope. The cloth was yellowed and cracking in places. It had the shape of something heavy, something once alive. She reached in. Edwin stepped back. No, you don't have to. But she already had her fingers under the fabric, tugging the edge back with a trembling hand. What emerged was unmistakable. A horse's head, desiccated, mummified, but still terrifyingly intact. Its mane brittle pulled tight against shrunken skin. The eyes were long gone, leaving 2 black pits that seemed to pulse in the shadows. Its jaw hung slightly open, and between the shriveled lips, Mira saw the bit still latched in place, with a cracked leather bridle. It looked like it had been screaming when it died, and still hadn't finished. Mira stared, not in horror, in recognition. The breath left her body like an old familiar ghost had climbed out of her lungs. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself on the edge of the crate. Edwin approached slowly. He couldn't help it now. What the hell is this? And then he saw it. Beneath the head, nestled into the bottom of the crate, was a small leather-bound notebook, old warped from moisture but still sealed shut with twine. The front cover bore only a single phrase, etched deep into the hide. I sealed it. He reached in and took the book, turning it over in his hands. Why would someone... Clink. They both stopped. Edwin turned around sharply. Did you hear that? Clink. Again. Mira stood up, her head turning slowly toward the far end of the warehouse. Clink. It was closer now, echoing off the metal. Crisp, precise, like a hoof, not walking, pacing. I swear to God, this place is not okay, Edwin muttered. We need to get out. Call someone. I don't know, hazmat. This is some kind of burial thing or cult shit, maybe war crimes. He backed away, but Mira didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the horse's head. She stepped forward, and as she did, the crate groaned again. The head shifted ever so slightly as though the dead weight had been disturbed, but it wasn't physics. It was something else. She reached out and touched the jaw. A low hum vibrated through the wood. She flinched. Then the sound changed. From the silence rose something worse. Not clink, not hoofbeats. Something beneath that. Breathing. Heavy, labored, not from her, not from Edwin. It was coming from the far side of the room where the steel stairwell led to the upper mezzanine. Mira's head turned but slowly, almost respectfully. Do you see anything? Edwin whispered. She didn't answer. Do you? Then he saw it. On the camera feed. He'd left his phone propped up on a storage box, still recording the lens angled toward the open crate. On screen, barely visible in the grainy footage, something moved. Not a shadow. Not dust. 2 eyes. Bright red. Blinking once. Twice. Then disappearing. Jesus, he whispered. Tell me that's not... But then it was gone. Nothing but empty pixels. He ran to grab his phone. The recording was glitching. Lines of static. Color inversion. Then back to normal. Mira finally spoke. Quiet. Controlled. It's awake. What? She didn't answer. The horse's head still stared upward, mouth slightly open, as though waiting for the next line in a conversation only it could hear. Edwin flipped open the notebook. Most of the pages were faded, the ink smudged or lost to mildew. But near the center, one page held fast. The words were etched in a hand that had shaken with more than age. I was ordered to do it. They told me to nail its feet down. They told me it was a beast, but it was only angry. Angry for what we took, for what we buried. It never forgave us, so I sealed it. In the name of silence, in the name of guilt. I sealed it, and prayed no one would ever ask why. Beneath the final word, a dark smear bled into the paper, like someone had pressed their thumb into blood and dragged it down the page. Edwin stepped back slowly. This isn't an artifact, he said, voice shaking. It's a confession. Mira nodded once. Then the power went out. Every light in the warehouse flickered and died in an instant. Total darkness swallowed the room. Edwin cursed, fumbling for his phone. In the pitch black, the sound returned. Clink, 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 closer, from every direction, like hooves pacing a circle. And then a new sound. Breath, wet, animal, and something else. A whisper, barely a whisper. But Mira heard it. She knew the language, not the words. The pain. She stepped between Edwin and the crate. Go, she said, quiet but firm. What no? I'm not leaving you here. But she didn't look at him. Her eyes were still locked on the dark space just beyond the crate. On the thing breathing there. Waiting. I know what this is, she said. And she did. Not the name, but the feeling. The sound of power being stripped from something sacred. The violence of domestication. The quiet agony of something meant to run, now boxed, bridled, nailed. She whispered a word from her childhood. A word her grandmother used when animals were dying in ways they weren't supposed to. Paslang, slaughter without prayer. Edwin's flashlight flicked on his hand, shaking. He aimed it toward the crate. But there was nothing, only the crate. And the head. But the eyes, those hollow sockets, no longer looked empty. They shimmered. Not reflection, moisture, or rage, or both. She stepped closer to the horse's head and whispered, "I won't bury you again." A soft wind pushed through the rafters above, rattling the beams. And from somewhere deep in the warehouse, almost inaudible, a whinny, faint, distant, but real. Edwin's light flickered again. Mira turned to him slowly. "We just opened the wrong memory." His mouth opened, but no words came. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, the hoofbeats began to walk. The notebook trembled in Edwin's hands, not from movement, but from implication. Each page he turned seemed older than the one before it, as if time itself unraveled backwards within the leather spine. The ink had bled and broken across the paper like veins of guilt branching across brittle skin. Mira stood silently beside him, eyes fixed on the words as they emerged line by fractured line. The entry had no date, just a heading. He would not be written. The handwriting was uneven, carved deep into the page, as if the act of writing had hurt the hand that wrote it. They brought the horse from the dreaming lands, where no white foot had ever stood. He was not bred. He was found. The elders said he was not meant to be owned, not meant to be looked in the eye. But the soldiers didn't believe in sacred things, only leashes and nails. Mira swallowed hard. Edwin's breath hitched as he kept reading. They tried saddles. He broke them. They tried hunger. He refused to kneel. So they brought iron, hot and hungry. 4 of them held him down. They nailed the shoes into his hooves not with care, but with conquest. A pause in the ink. Then he screamed when the first nail went in. The kind of scream that tears the world in half. The kind of scream that makes birds fall out of trees. They said it was just a beast. But we all saw it. It looked at us like men. It knew. And we knew it knew. Mira felt her chest tighten. She didn't know whether the pain was from the words or from something in the room. Something pressing between the lines and into her ribs. On the 4th day, he snapped the chains. The soldier with the whip never made it home. The one who lit the forge was found with eyes wide open and no voice. They called it a curse. The elders called it a debt. The page ended with a single line, so they buried him beneath iron and oath and silence. But nothing sacred stays buried forever. Mira's dreams started that night. Or maybe they weren't dreams. They didn't come with sleep. They came with stillness. With the closing of her eyes. With the weightlessness just before thought begins. She was always standing in a field. Empty, gray, not real, like a photo losing color. Wind moved around her, but the grass didn't bend. And then came the sound. Clink, clink, clink. Slow, echoing, hoofbeats over steel. She turned. The horizon was empty until it wasn't. A figure emerged from the mist. Black, shimmering, muscular. A stallion, but unlike anything she had seen. Its mane moved like smoke. Its body shone with an oil-slick sheen. And its eyes burned like coals left too long in the hearth. It ran without noise. Then came the fence, barbed wire. Endless, stretching in all directions. The horse approached, slowed, and pressed its neck against the wire. Mira wanted to scream, to move, to stop it, but her body refused. Her breath caught. The wire cut. Blood didn't pour. It wept, thin, dark, and slow. The stallion didn't cry out. It only looked at her, with those eyes, the same red shimmer from the camera. And the dream would always end there, with that stare crawling into her skin. By morning, Mira looked paler, hollowed. But she said nothing. Her silence was not retreat. It was fermentation. Edwin noticed the change. "Are you sleeping?" he asked, voice tentative, a little too soft for the harsh warehouse light. She didn't answer, but that night she returned to the notebook. She couldn't stop herself. There were more entries. Deeper, stranger. The author had become unhinged words, crammed into margins, lines scratched out, rewritten, then scratched again. They held a ceremony. Not Christian, not Noongar. Something twisted. The soldiers brought their priest. The elders brought silence. Together they built a prison beneath the earth. Not for the beast, for their shame. One passage was different. The ink was smeared uneven, as if written during a tremor. We closed the lid. We nailed it shut. 4 nails, 1 for each leg, 4 shoes, 1 for each sin. We placed it in the warehouse. We told no one. We hoped to forget. At the bottom of the page, barely visible, a sentence in red ink, dried and flaking. But the ground, remembers? The dreams worsened. Now she wasn't just a bystander. She was there, holding the hammer. Her hands, young, calloused, unclean, gripped the handle tight. A voice behind her said, "Hit it again," and she obeyed. She drove the nail into bone, through hoof, into wood. The horse screamed beneath her. but the sound was muffled, like underwater thunder. She felt it more than heard it. The voice repeated again, and she obeyed. She woke up shaking, gasping, fingers cramped, like they still held the hammer. Blood had pooled at the base of her palms. Not real, but not fake. She began researching the Noongar people, their oral histories, their stories of animals who crossed between worlds. Creatures who were not beasts, but guides. Spirits and forms the white world refused to recognize. She found the word Yaraba, not a name, a warning. Roughly translated, that which watches when no one should. She wrote it down on a scrap of paper and tucked it into her sleeve. The name felt like a key, but keys only work if you know which door you've already opened. Edwin came to her the next morning, eyes red-rimmed. "I saw it," he whispered. She looked at him, waited. "In the footage." I slowed it down, frame by frame. He turned his phone toward her. On screen, the warehouse. Still. Dust particles floating. And then in the far back corner, two glimmers. Red, not eyes. Too symmetrical. Too knowing. "I ran it through a heat filter," he said. It had a signature. Faint, but present. And it moved. But here's the thing. He paused. It didn't cast a shadow. Mira's hands tightened. "I think we woke something up," he said. She shook her head slowly. "No." He looked at her confused. "I think we reminded it we're still here." She pulled the notebook out of her bag and flipped to the last entry. It was blank. No words. Just a page scorched at the bottom edge, as though someone had tried to burn it but changed their mind at the last second. Then she flipped it. The inside back cover. A single phrase barely visible in pencil. "He will stop when the blood remembers." Mira closed the book. She looked at Edwin, then at her own hands. She turned them over slowly. Beneath her left thumbnail, a thin line of dried brown traced the cuticle. Not dirt. Something older. Iron-tinted, like the memory of rust. The dreams became daytime. Not hallucinations. Not quite. More like echoes. She'd turn a corner and see the tail of a black mane disappear around a corner. She'd hear a grunt in the stairwell too deep for human lungs. A low wicker beneath the floorboards of the museum. And always the same message repeated in the back of her skull. "You helped bury me." She didn't know who it was meant for, but it knew her, and she was starting to believe she knew it. Then came the vision. Not a dream, not a memory. Something in between. She was walking through fire. Not flames, but smoke. Thick, hot, stinging. Around her were tents, broken, bloodied, collapsed, men screaming, and through it all hoofbeats. Furious, terrible, charging without mercy. She turned. The black horse, larger now, taller than any stallion she'd ever seen. Its mouth wide, screaming not in rage, in grief. Then it turned on her, rushed her, eyes locked. And just before the impact, she whispered, "I remember," and everything stopped. She woke up on the museum floor, hands raw, nails dirty, and on her palm, a single rusty horseshoe nail, clutched tight. The sound never came all at once. It slipped in under the noise, between the clatter of boots and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Mira heard it in the cracks of silence when conversation paused, when wind stalled, when breath hitched. A hoof, one, then two, and the pace was increasing. She'd count them quietly when no one was watching. 4 hoofbeats, then 8, then 12. A gallop trying to break through the walls of her skull. At first she believed it was memory, that strange kind of psychic bleed that trauma leaves behind, where thought becomes echo. But this was not echo. This was a signal, and she was the receiver. She barely spoke now. Where she once at least nodded, offered monosyllables, now there was stillness. Edwin noticed. He sat across from her in the back room of the museum. The crate now sealed again, but lined with sensors, UV scanners, and steel brackets the preservation team had insisted on. He watched her sip her tea like someone practicing the act of being alive. "You haven't said a word all day." Mira didn't respond. "You're scaring the interns." Still nothing. He sighed, then tried a different angle. "Did you sleep?" She blinked once slow, then again, then finally no. The word hung in the air like a crack in glass. Edwin rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Look, I get it. What we found, it's strange. Hell, it's..." He hesitated. "Disturbing. But we have protocols. We need to analyze this thing properly, right? Chain of custody, peer review, institutional context." Mira turned toward him. There was something different in her face. Not fear, not grief, not even exhaustion. Conviction. "The crate isn't the artifact," she said softly. "We are." He frowned. "What does that mean?" But she was already walking away. That night, Edwin stayed behind. Part stubbornness, part guilt, but mostly curiosity. The crate was bolted into a containment chamber in the basement exhibit hall. Temperature controlled. Humidity sensors active. He sat just outside, phone in hand, scrolling through yet another half-translated page from the Noongar oral archives. He didn't hear it at first, not consciously, but somewhere around 3:22 a.m. he paused. His thumb hovered above the screen. There it was. Not the hoofbeats, something else. Breathing, not his own. It was slow, deep, like air being pulled through a throat too wide for a human larynx. Ragged but steady, measured, almost patient. He stood. The camera in the corner of the chamber blinked red, recording as scheduled. He walked to the window. The crate was still. No movement, no rattling. But the room felt wrong, as if gravity had shifted sideways by a fraction of a degree, as if the walls had bowed outward just enough to make his skin itch. Then the breathing stopped, only to be replaced by a sigh, drawn out, not weary, not sad. Something else, ancient, resigned, and not from a human mouth. He stumbled back, knocking over his chair. The noise snapped him out of it, and the sound vanished instantly, as if it had never been there at all. But he knew what he'd heard. He looked at the security camera feed, rewound, replayed, and right there, at the edge of the infrared overlay, a single bloom of heat. Not Mira, not him. Something coiled, equine in silhouette, breathing. The next morning, Mira found Edwin pacing. His skin was pale, lips dry. He didn't wait for her to speak. "You were right," he said. She raised an eyebrow. He glanced toward the crate, now doubly padlocked. "It's not dead. Not in the way we understand it." She looked past him, to the door. "To bury something isn't to kill it," she said. "It's to pretend you can." He shook his head. "You want to explain that?" "No," she said. "You've already started to feel it." A pause. Then he whispered, "I dreamed of a fence." Her gaze locked with his. He understood then that she'd seen it too. Not metaphor, not allegory. Shared experience. By noon, the museum director had arrived. Dr. Madeline Voss, a woman as sharp-edged as the steel earrings she wore, and just as cold. She walked into the room, flanked by two men in suits, external contractors from the Department of Heritage and Collections. "What the hell have you two been doing with this thing?" she snapped. Edwin stepped forward, defensive. "We've documented it thoroughly. Preserved it. Nobody's mishandled. I'm not talking about protocols," she cut in. "I'm talking about rumors." She pulled out a stack of papers, printouts of emails, social media posts, a Reddit thread titled "The Screaming Horse of Perth." Photos, leaks. The image of the crate, the horseshoes, even a blurry screenshot of the red eyes from the camera footage. "You've gone and stirred a myth," she said. "We're not in the business of folklore. This is a museum, not a seance." Mira spoke up. "I want to hold a ceremony." The room fell silent. Madeline turned. "I'm sorry." A release, Mira said calmly. "A letting go. Not for the object, for what it holds." Madeline stared at her, then laughed dry and clipped. "Absolutely not. This is an artifact of historical significance. It will be analyzed, logged, and potentially exhibited. You can burn incense on your own time." Edwin opened his mouth, but Mira stepped in front of him. "You don't understand," she said. "No," Madeline snapped. "You don't. We are custodians of truth, not superstition. This crate doesn't hold anything. It's wood and iron and dust." Then, without meaning to, she glanced toward the observation window, and her voice faltered. They left the room soon after. Mira and Edwin stood in the hallway. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't hesitation. It was momentum. Edwin leaned against the wall. "She's going to put it in the west wing," he said, "behind glass." Mira said nothing. He looked at her. "So what now?" She answered without turning her head. "I'm going to find someone who knows how to speak to it." He hesitated. "You mean someone spiritual?" She shook her head. "Someone honest." That night, Mira sat alone in her apartment. No lights, no sound. Just the rhythmic pulse of the fan overhead ticking like a clock wound too tight. She laid out the notebook on the floor. Unwrapped a piece of cloth she'd hidden in her coat, a strip of bridle leather, retrieved quietly from the crate when no one was looking. It smelled like rain. She placed it gently across the pages, closed her eyes, and listened. The hoofbeats were louder now, no longer confined to sleep. They galloped across the walls of her thoughts, scarring every quiet space she used to hide inside. And through it all, a voice hoarse, heavy, thick with old hurt began to speak. Not in words, in rhythm, in breath, in demand. She opened her eyes, wrote a name she'd never learned, but somehow knew. At the museum, the crate waited, but the room around it did not rest. Objects fell, lights flickered, and once, on a Friday night, a security guard quit mid-shift, claiming he saw something breathing through the glass. Dr. Voss had it all removed from the report, but the whispers spread. Among interns, among docents, among the walls. The hoofbeats had returned, and they were getting closer. The scent came before the voice. Sharp, clean, earthy. Something between eucalyptus and fire. It threaded through the west wing of the museum like a whisper that lingered long after it should have vanished. Visitors didn't notice. Docents pretended not to. But Mira stopped in her tracks the moment it hit her lungs. She knew that smell. Burned peppermint leaves, sacred in quiet places. It always came when the old woman arrived. Auntie Lila moved slowly, not from weakness, but from rhythm. Every step she took carried intention, like she was placing memory into the floor beneath her. She wore a dark cotton shawl despite the heat, her long gray braid resting like a line of ash over her shoulder. She walked without asking permission, past signs, velvet ropes, and museum staff who pretended they didn't see her. Not out of rudeness, out of reverence and fear. Because Auntie Lila was one of the last voices of the land no one wanted to remember. She stopped in front of the crate, didn't look at it, just stood, breathed, then closed her eyes. Her nose twitched. Her fingers curled lightly, and she whispered, "So they've let it out again." Mira approached slowly, the air between them dense with something Mira couldn't name but could feel. Like a song only the old knew the tune to. Lila opened her eyes. They were pale gray, cloudy, but sharp, like river stones that had seen too many floods. "You're the girl who opened it," Lila said. It wasn't a question. Mira didn't deny it. "I didn't know what it was." "No one ever does," Lila said, voice soft but edged. "That's why we keep burying it." They stood there, two women from different lines of exile, joined by something neither had asked for. Edwin appeared around the corner, clipboard and handphone in the other. He looked up, startled. "Oh, sorry, this area is currently restricted to..." Lila didn't even turn to him. She raised a hand slightly and pointed at the crate. "Smell that." He paused. "What? The metal?" He frowned. "It's iron. Aged. Treated, probably sealed with..." "No," Lila said. "Not what it is, what it holds." Edwin looked to Mira, unsure. Lila stepped closer to the crate. She didn't touch it, just stood there, eyes closed again. "That's not a box," she murmured. "That's a grave. A bloody one. Not to hide the creature. To bury what we did to it." Mira felt something tighten in her chest. "You mean what the soldiers did?" Edwin offered. Lila opened her eyes, and for the first time looked directly at him. Her stare pinned him where he stood. "The moment you say they, you wash your hands." Silence. "You think this is history?" Lila said, turning back to the crate. "Something with a date, a label, a climate-controlled home. But this is a sin still breathing." Edwin swallowed. I don't mean disrespect. We're just trying to preserve." "No one preserves rot," she cut in. "You scrape it, you burn it, or it grows." Mira stepped closer. "Then why not let it go?" Lila's voice dropped low, almost inaudible. "Because letting go means someone has to remember the pain. And most people are too scared of memory." They sat in the atrium, later Mira and Lila. The peppermint smoke still clung to Mira's clothes like a veil. Outside, children ran through the museum courtyard, laughing, chasing pigeons. But inside, everything Mira carried felt centuries old. "You've been hearing it, haven't you?" Lila asked. Mira nodded. "In dreams, and not dreams." "Good," Lila said. Mira frowned. "Why good?" Lila sipped from her chipped thermos. "Because it means it's speaking to you, and not screaming." They sat in silence for a long time. Then Mira said, "There's something I need to ask." Lila waited. "When I was little, back in Pampanga, my father brought a horse home. A black one. Said he'd won it in a bet. He was proud. Said no one else could break it. That it bowed only to him." She paused. Her hands trembled slightly. "I remember. He made it kneel in front of our family altar. Tied its legs and forced its head down." Her voice cracked. "He called it obedience. He said the horse carried pride, and pride needed breaking." Lila didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. "I didn't think of it again until now," Mira whispered. "Until I saw the eyes in that dream." She looked up. They were the same. Lila nodded once. "There are things we inherit that no country can see," she said. "Hurts passed down, not through stories, but through silence." Mira blinked fast, holding something back. "And sometimes," Lila continued, "the ones we think we've tamed, they don't stay broken." Back inside, Dr. Voss stood before a group of reporters and museum staff in the press hall. Behind her, a large projection screen displayed a digitally enhanced image of the crate, sanitized, sepia-toned, rebranded as a colonial artifact of cultural convergence. She used words like important find, conservation dialogue, and historic interpretation. But not once did she say trauma. Not once did she say spirit. Not once did she say horse. Lila and Mira stood at the back of the room. Lila leaned close. "That's the second death," she said quietly. "What is when people turn truth into exhibit?" Later, Mira stood alone in front of the crate again. The hallway was empty. The museum had closed. The staff had gone home. Only the cameras remained blinking red in the shadows. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. It was cold. Behind it, the crate sat still. But something moved, not visible, not audible, but felt. A slow, aching rhythm that pulsed just beneath the wood. A memory of nails, of fire, of being forced to kneel. And somewhere deep inside her, something mirrored it. A memory of her own knees against tile. Her father's voice behind her. Lower. And she had. Not because she understood, but because children obey, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. And now the hoofbeats were no longer just sounds. They were her heartbeat. In her chest. In her ears. In her bones. That night she lit her own peppermint leaves. Not in ritual. In rebellion. And as the smoke rose to the ceiling, curling in spirals that made no pattern, Mira whispered, "I will not bury this again." The road stretched out like an abandoned sentence, half-written, windswept, and unfinished. They drove in silence, Mira at the wheel. Edwin in the passenger seat, hands resting on his lap like they were afraid of themselves. The sun had begun its slow descent into amber, casting long shadows across the decaying wire fences that flanked either side of the road. The farther they moved from the city, the thinner time felt like they were peeling back the layers of something that had been desperately trying to stay buried. Mira didn't check the map. She didn't need to. Her memory didn't function the way most people's did. It didn't come in images or voices. It came in textures, in vibrations beneath her ribs, in the way her skin reacted when the car passed the invisible perimeter of somewhere sacred or cursed. They turned off the road onto a dirt path. No signpost, no gate, only a skeletal remnant of something once fenced in. On either side, stumps of wood jutted out like broken teeth. The path became rougher. Edwin gripped the doorframe. Mira kept driving. "This used to be a training camp," she said, her voice the first thing to break the silence in nearly 40 minutes. "British colonial outpost." It had a different name back then. "What name?" Edwin asked. "I don't say it anymore," she answered. The tires crunched to a stop. Before them stretched an open field, burnt grass, patches of sand, a few gnarled trees hunched like ashamed elders. And in the center, a large rectangular foundation of cracked concrete, overgrown with weeds and silence. Edwin stepped out, squinting against the sun. "What happened here?" Mira closed the car door and walked. He followed. They stood in the middle of the concrete slab. It was colder here, not from wind or shade, but from something that pulsed beneath the earth. Edwin looked down at the cracks under his boots. Some of them weren't random. They curved inward. Patterns, circles, marks too purposeful to be time's doing. Mira crouched, ran her hand along the concrete. "This is where they sealed it," she whispered. "Before the crate. Before museums. Before people tried to pretend they didn't hear the screaming." She sat down, not like someone taking a break, but like someone returning to a seat they never asked to leave. Edwin stood back uncertain. "They nailed the horse here?" he asked. Mira nodded. "And others?" He frowned. "Others. People. Culture. Spirit. It wasn't about taming a horse. That's just what the history books say, so they can sleep at night." He turned away, staring at the horizon. It was barren, but his chest ached. "Jesus," he whispered. "How do we carry this?" Mira looked up. "You don't carry it." He looked at her. "You sit with it, and you let it rot through you, until it's yours." Edwin exhaled. The air felt thick. "I feel like I'm standing on something sacred. But I don't belong here." "You do now," she said. "Because I opened it." "No," she said. "Because you heard it." She stood, walked to the far end of the concrete slab. There, half buried beneath weeds, was something small and square. She bent down, fingers brushing aside dirt. A hinge, rusty, ancient. She pulled gently. A small compartment, about the size of a shoebox. Inside, a rusted nail, still coated with dried flakes of something once red. She didn't touch it, just looked at it. Edwin came up beside her. "Is that one of the originals?" she said. "From the first sealing." He leaned closer. Why was it left here? Because they didn't finish the ritual. They rushed. They panicked. And the ground doesn't forget shortcuts. Mira stood. Her face was pale now, but calm. "I need to be alone for a moment," she said. He hesitated. "You sure?" She nodded. Edwin stepped back, sat at the edge of the slab. His eyes drifted toward the fading sun, but his ears remained alert. Mira returned to the center. She knelt, her hands pressed flat against the concrete. And then she began to cry. Not loudly, not in sobs, but in waves. Tears that came from a depth she didn't know she possessed. Tears that weren't just hers. They belonged to every woman who had watched a creature be broken. To every girl who had learned silence as her first language. To every colonized body made to kneel in front of a god that didn't resemble her mother. The wind picked up. A low howl passed through the grass. Mira trembled. Not from cold, from recognition. She was no longer in the present. She saw herself again, 8 years old, standing barefoot in the dirt behind her childhood home. Her father's hands gripped the reins of the black horse he'd brought home. She remembered the snort, the fight, the fear. But most of all, the kneeling. How he had tied the front legs. How he forced the creature's head down toward the altar, yelling something about obedience and hierarchy and God's order. And how she had stood there, watching, silent, participating through absence. Her father had turned to her, sweating triumphant. "See," he said, "he knows his place." But Mira had not answered. She had stared into the horse's eyes and seen something that looked like her own reflection, only angrier. She had never forgotten that. Back in the field, Mira's hands moved slowly. She reached behind her head, unclipped her hair, and from it removed a small, thin metal hairpin, silver-curved, slightly rusted. It had belonged to her mother, She had worn it through school, through immigration interviews, through marriages and mourning. Now Mira pressed it into the dirt. Not violently. Carefully. Tenderly. Like an offering. The metal slid in with surprising ease. She left it halfway buried like a root, finally choosing to stop searching. Edwin watched from afar. He didn't speak, didn't move, only observed. And he knew that tiny gesture meant more than any press release, any academic paper, any exhibit. It was a return of something stolen. To the earth it was taken from. The light shifted, not sunset. Something internal, like the slab itself sighed, and then the wind stopped. Completely. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, as if something had finally paused to listen. Mira opened her eyes. Her cheeks were damp, her breath slow, and she felt lighter, not freed, but forgiven. She stood, legs unsteady but firm, walked back toward Edwin. He looked up. His eyes were glassy. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, but didn't speak. Words would have ruined it. He stood beside her. Together they looked back at the slab. It didn't look like concrete anymore. It looked like a scar, and scars don't disappear, but they do stop bleeding. Eventually, as they walked back to the car, Edwin broke the silence. "I didn't know it would feel like this." "Like what?" "Like being split open." Mira smiled. Faint, but real. "That's how you know it's working." They drove off slowly, dust trailing behind them, like smoke from a fire just put out. Behind them the field stood still. The pin glinted in the dirt. And from somewhere beneath the earth, a slow, distant sound echoed. Not a scream, not a cry, just a heartbeat. Finally, in rhythm, it began with a single vibration, so faint it barely registered on the museum's security feed. Just a low tremor in the floor beneath the crate, like the building had exhaled in its sleep. Then came the second, then the third, and then the hoofbeats. They didn't echo this time. They pulsed, deep, visceral, like a drum carved from memory. It was 3:06 a.m. Outside, the sky tore open with lightning. Rain fell in jagged sheets, slapping the glass panels above the west wing. Inside, the power stuttered once, just enough for the lights to flicker. But it wasn't enough to wake the guards. Not yet. The first nail launched itself from the crate with a crack like a gunshot. It ricocheted off the far wall and embedded itself in a wooden display labeled Objects of Subjugation. A second nail followed. Then a third. The crate began to heave, like something inside it was taking shallow, furious breaths. The security cameras caught all of it. But the feed corrupted every fourth frame. A red flicker, two glowing eyes, then static. Mira jolted upright in her bed. Her ears rang even in the silence. She knew. She didn't check her phone. Didn't gather her things. She was already dressed in black. She slipped on her coat, stepped into the storm, and let the rain baptize her back into the curse. At the museum, the alarm system had failed, but one light still blinked a silent red LED above the archival vault. Edwin stood just inside, soaked to the bone. He'd arrived minutes before Mira, drawn by something he couldn't explain. The crate now sat in the center of the room, bolts blown wide, horseshoes scattered across the marble floor like shrapnel. It wasn't shaking anymore. It was breathing. He could feel it in the soles of his feet, in the roots of his teeth. He tried to approach, but his knees buckled before he reached the halfway point. The air was thick, syrupy, charged like pre-lightning. The room had weight now. History had mass, and it was bearing down. Mira pushed open the doors with a force that didn't belong to her frame. Lightning flared through the skylights above, casting her silhouette long and jagged across the floor. She didn't look at Edwin. Didn't speak. She just stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a low moan. The rain muted. Only the breath of the crate remained. Camera POV, mounted on the far wall. Wide angle. Silent feed. We watch from above, as Mira moves closer to the crate. We watch as Edwin stumbles to his feet and follows behind, eyes wide. Then, at the edge of frame, movement. Fast. Too fast. A red blur. No. Two eyes, burning like coals soaked in blood. They streak past the camera down the far hallway, then vanish. Back in the frame, Mira stops. Her head turns slowly. She doesn't run. She lifts her arms slow, steady. And what she does next is not defensive, not aggressive. She mimics the act of drawing reins. Her hands hover in mid-air, fingers slightly curled, as if holding an invisible bridle. Her body centers legs, shoulder-width apart, spine upright. A posture of command, but also of invitation, of remembrance. Her hands don't tremble. She breathes once, deep, and holds. The red eyes return, charging, down the hallway, toward her. No sound, no hoofbeat, just pure impossible speed. It crosses the room in a second. The camera glitching in pulses. Mira holds her ground. Her hands remain raised. No words, only movement, only posture. The red mass barrels toward her, its form half visible, now the outline of a horse on fire wrapped in smoke and rage. Then it stops, inches from her. Stillness. Then a low sound. Not a neigh, not a whinny. A sigh, so deep it shakes the lights. And Mira speaks, soft, a whisper only the air hears. You were never meant to be ridden. Her eyes lift. And you were never a monster. The thing exhales again. The red begins to flicker, not fade. Soften, like rage melting into memory. She steps forward, one foot, then another. She raises her right hand, and touches, not flesh, not fur, but air, tense, alive, and full of electricity. She presses her palm gently forward. The sound that emerges is not of pain. It is of relief, a groan from the walls, the ceiling, from the very bones of the building. Then, a crack. From the crate, it splits down the middle. The wood fractures. The nails embedded in the floor begin to tremble. The horseshoes rattle, and lightning strikes the museum. The entire building goes white. Then, silence. The emergency lights flicker back to life. Dim, amber, safe. Mira stands alone. The crate now in pieces. Splinters across the floor. The horse's skull, gone. Only the bridle remains, coiled neatly. Clean, as if placed there, as if returned. Edwin staggers forward. His face is pale, tear-streaked. Did you see it? She nods. But not with these, she says, tapping her temple. He looks around. The room is still, but different, like something has been removed. A tumor excised. He kneels by the bridle, reaches toward it, then stops, looks to Mira. She nods once, and he lifts it. It's warm, not hot, alive. He wraps it gently in his coat. What now, he asks. Mira looks toward the shattered crate. Then upward. Through the broken skylight, dawn begins to rise. The curse doesn't end, she says. It just changes shape. A pause. And now, it belongs to us. From the far end of the hallway, a single sound, a hoofbeat, soft, distant, and then another, then nothing. Outside, the storm breaks, and the first light of morning casts gold across the museum walls. Mira and Edwin walk into it silent. Together, the museum smelled of rain and scorched wood. The crate was gone, dismembered by the night's fury, scattered in fragments across polished marble, like the bones of a forgotten language. But the center of the blast zone held something still, something untouched. A single iron horseshoe, rust clinging to it like dried blood. No movement now, no breathing, no hum, just stillness and memory. Mira knelt in front of the remnant. The air around it felt different, lighter, yet charged like static born from reverence. She didn't reach for it immediately. She just watched it as if asking permission from a presence no longer visible, but still deeply present. Edwin stood beside her. Neither spoke, because what could be said? There was no ceremony for this, only instinct. Mira finally reached down, lifting the horseshoe with both hands. It was cold, heavier than it looked. And as she held it, she felt it wasn't just an object anymore. It was a wound, encased in metal, waiting for burial. They drove in silence again, back to the place where it had all begun. Not the museum, not the crate, but the slab of concrete where the first betrayal had been sealed. The colonial outpost long turned to ruin. But they weren't alone this time. Auntie Lila was waiting. She stood wrapped in her shawl, a bundle of dried leaves in one hand, a weather-worn digging tool in the other. Behind her, the field swayed beneath a soft breeze, whispering in a language the wind hadn't spoken in decades. Mira stepped out, still holding the horseshoe. Auntie Lila nodded, but said nothing. This wasn't a moment for words. It was a moment for return. They walked together, three figures moving across the field, like shadows pulled back into the earth. At the center of the slab, where the last ceremony had failed, and where Mira had once wept on cracked stone, Auntie Lila knelt first. She placed the leaf bundle down, lit a match, and let the peppermint smoke curl into the air. The smell was immediate, sharp, pure ancient. Mira followed, lowering the horseshoe into a shallow grave. She pressed her palms into the dirt, breathing slow. Behind her, Edwin took out his camera but hesitated. Ask, Auntie Lila said, without looking up. Is it okay if I record this? Only if you listen first. He lowered the camera and listened. Mira began to hum. She didn't know the song. Her mother had once sung it over a bowl of steaming water long ago, when someone in the house had a fever. The melody was fractured, half-remembered, built more from breath than tone. But it rose now instinctively, like steam from the soil. Auntie Lila joined her, her voice deeper, rooted. The two women didn't harmonize, they wove. Their tones drifted in and around each other, creating something more elemental than music. It wasn't grief. It wasn't joy. It was release. Edwin sat down, camera forgotten, and cried, not from sorrow, but from recognition. For once, the air didn't resist it. When the song ended, the earth felt quieter. The horseshoe had disappeared beneath the dirt. Not forgotten, but accepted. Mira stood. She looked at her hands covered in soil nails, chipped knuckles raw, but they didn't shake. For the first time since the crate had opened, her body felt her own. Not haunted, not borrowed, whole. They didn't speak on the drive back. They didn't need to. The silence was generous now. Not empty. Full of things understood but unspoken. When they returned to the city, Edwin dropped Mira off at her apartment. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't need to. He just said, "See you tomorrow." And for once, she smiled. The next morning, Edwin stood before the museum's board. His voice was clear. His proposal simple. We make no exhibit, no display, no plaque. Brows furrowed, eyes narrowed. He continued, we create a room, small, quiet, no artifacts, no photos, no text, just space. A pause and silence. Someone scoffed, For what purpose? Edwin looked up. To listen. Another pause. Longer this time. Then he added, we've displayed 1,000 stories. But this one wants to be heard. 2 weeks later, the room of stillness opened. No ceremony. No ribbon. Just a door. People came in ones and twos. No more. Some sat on the floor. Some stood eyes closed. Some left after a minute. Some stayed for hours. No one explained it. No one needed to. In the corner sat a small placard, wooden smooth, unmarked, except for one line. Some memories must echo before they rest. Mira visited once. Only once. She sat cross-legged in the center, her hair loose cascading over her shoulders like dark water. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She just breathed. In, out. And when she stood to leave, her face was different. Not free, but no longer captive. She walked to the door, turned once, and smiled. Not at anyone, at the space, at the echo, at the silence, and then walked into the sunlight. Finally, unburdened, the rain came soft and steady. Not the rage of storms past, not the cleansing of floodwaters, but a kind of morning rain. Thin silver and constant, like the sky had finally remembered what it meant to grieve with grace. They gathered quietly. On the field once used for drills, now cleared, now sacred. No chairs, no microphones, no announcements. Just people, locals in weathered jackets, elders wrapped in woven shawls, museum staff still in their ID lanyards trying not to be noticed. And in the middle of it all, an altar of stone, newly built, but ancient in its energy, low to the ground, flat-topped, shaped like a hoofprint etched into the earth. On its surface, a single indentation, shallow, purposeful, waiting. Auntie Lila stood to one side, her shawl dark with rain, but her posture proud. Her hands rested on her cane, but her gaze swept across the crowd like a lighthouse, steady warning, unblinking. Behind her, Mira stood, no longer a ghost, no longer haunted. She wore no black, no veil. Her hair fell loosely, and her hands were empty, except for what they carried inside her. And then, a child stepped forward, a girl of no more than 7, brown curls clinging to her cheeks, eyes wide as the sky. She carried something wrapped in cloth, both hands cupped around it, as if it were still warm. She walked toward the stone altar, footsteps soft against wet grass, and unwrapped the cloth. Inside, a horseshoe, iron, heavy. A little rust clung to its edge, like a whisper that had survived too long. She placed it gently into the groove. It fit perfectly. The air held still. Then the child looked up at her mother standing nearby and asked, voice small but clear, "Why doesn't anyone say its name?" The mother didn't flinch. She looked down at her daughter and after a moment bent low to her level. "Because it was something we all forgot," she said. "Not just the name, like a secret, like a scar." "Was it bad?" The mother paused. "No," she said. "It was hurt." And no one helped. The girl nodded, looked back at the altar, and did not cry. Only listened. A gust of wind moved through the field, the kind of wind that carried more than air. And from somewhere beyond the trees, from the hills that framed the sky, a whinny, distant, clear, not a scream, not a threat, just a voice, returning, not to haunt, but to remind. No one flinched. No one ran. They only listened and looked toward the horizon, where no shape appeared, only the echo, the sound of something once wounded now running. Free! Mira felt the rain soak through her shirt, and she didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt nothing needed shielding. Her body stood still, but her soul was moving. She looked to Lila, who nodded, not in approval, not in pride, but in completion, like a drumbeat ending, like a prayer landing. Mira closed her eyes, and in the dark behind her eyelids she saw it, not the crate, not the nails, not the eyes, just a field, and a shadow running across it, unbound, and at peace. The sky began to break. Just a little, a patch of gold above the gray. No one clapped. No one spoke. They only stayed, letting the silence fill them, letting it echo, letting it teach. Then, black screen, total, a breath held. And finally text, slow and stark, carved across the darkness, like etching on bone. Some wounds were never meant to be buried. They were meant to be told. So no one forgets. So no one repeats. Fade out, then nothing, just the sound of a single hoofbeat, dissolving into memory.